The day the Werk Armada arrived above Kessel Station, I was eating a cold bowl of synthetic noodles and trying not to think about how badly my shift rotation had gone wrong. That's the honest truth of it. No dramatic build-up. No sense that history was about to pivot on the actions of one exhausted, underpaid, slightly sunburned station guard named Corporal Darren Mace. I was sitting with my back against the exterior wall of Bay 7, watching the dust devils spin across the loading apron, listening to the thermal groaning of the station's outer hull as the twin suns of the Reach settled toward the horizon. Kessel Station wasn't glamorous. That's the first thing anyone who'd ever served there would tell you. It sat at the junction of three trade corridors, the Meridian Run, the Dust Arm, and what the freight haulers called the Long Sigh because the journey along it felt like it would never end. The station had been built in phases over something like 80 standard years, and you could tell. The old sections were solid, honest construction, thick plating, wide corridors, the kind of architecture that said we expect to be here a long time. The newer additions were the opposite. Prefabricated modules bolted onto prefabricated modules, connector tunnels that had a disconcerting flex to them when large ships docked, environmental seals that were technically within tolerance, but made you uncomfortably aware of the vacuum on the other side. About 60,000 people called it home on any given rotation. Traders, mechanics, families who drifted out here because the cost of living in the core was too high and the opportunities were supposed to be better on the frontier. A few thousand permanent staff running the docking systems, the medical bays, the markets, the administrative offices, and us, the Kessel Station Security Detachment. 72 officers, split across 3 watches, covering roughly 400 docking bays, 12 commercial districts, 3 residential sectors, and 1 extremely complicated political jurisdiction that nobody had ever fully resolved because the station technically sat in the gap between 4 different recognized territorial claims. We weren't military, that's important. We wore gray, not khaki or black. Our weapons were stun-capable sidearms and crowd-control pulse emitters. We handled disputes between merchants, processed transit violations, ran the standard identity verification checks on incoming vessels, and occasionally broke up fights in the market district when someone's negotiation over spice prices got more heated than it should have. We were, in the politest terms, a municipal security force. And the Werk Armada had just appeared in our sky. I want to explain what the Werk looked like, because it matters later. I'd seen them before, but not many humans had. They were rare visitors even in the frontier stations, tall, six-limbed, with a bioluminescent skin patterning that shifted with their emotional state in ways they couldn't fully control, which the diplomats said was a serious vulnerability in negotiations if you knew how to read it. Their upper 4 limbs were arms, articulated differently from ours, the joints bent in 2 directions, which gave their movements a quality that humans found profoundly unsettling. Like watching something move in a direction gravity hadn't agreed to. They were also, without any polite way to frame this, extremely good at war. The Werk expansionary doctrine, which was the diplomatic term for what was basically a long tradition of showing up somewhere with overwhelming force and demanding incorporation, had absorbed 11 systems in the past 40 standard years. They didn't obliterate. They weren't cruel in the obvious way. They arrived, they demonstrated capability, they presented terms, and the terms were always the same. Join the collective, surrender autonomous governance, keep your lives and most of your infrastructure. The ones who refused the terms got a demonstration of what refusing looked like. Nobody refused twice. The armada above us numbered, according to the automated tracking systems that started screaming at every station terminal the moment they translated in from FTL, 112 warships. The flagship alone was 2 kilometers long. I know that because I looked it up afterward. In the moment, staring up through the observation port with my half-eaten noodles forgotten on the floor, I couldn't have told you anything except that the sky had become full of ships in a way that the sky isn't supposed to be. Station Commander Yeva Bruck's voice came over the general channel 4 minutes after first contact. All personnel, this is Commander Bruck. We have confirmed contact with a Werk Armada formation. I want full station lockdown, all bays sealed, all civilian personnel to shelter positions. Security detachment, report to your assigned sectors. This is not a drill. She sounded calm. I'd served under Bruck for 3 years, and I knew she was the kind of person who could sound calm while standing in a building that was actively on fire. It didn't tell you anything about how calm she actually was, but it was still good to hear. I picked up my noodles, don't judge me. I was still hungry, sealed the container, clipped it to my belt, and headed for my assigned sector. Bay 7, the primary receiving bay, the one large enough to accommodate ships of diplomatic or military class. I thought about this later a lot. How I was assigned to Bay 7 specifically, because it was a slow rotation, nothing big was due in, so it was basically a punishment posting for guards who needed to be kept busy. How if I'd been on any other section of the duty roster, I'd have been shuffling civilians into shelter corridors and would never have been anywhere near what happened. Small things. The way history builds itself out of the random and the mundane. I reached Bay 7 about 12 minutes after the initial alert. The bay was enormous, big enough to dock a mid-size freighter with room to walk around it. The atmosphere was maintained by a series of environmental barriers rather than hard walls, which meant the outer edge of the bay was open to the loading apron and the sky beyond. Standard practice for high-traffic receiving bays, it made the logistics easier. It also meant that when I walked in, I could see the sky. And what I saw in the sky was a shuttle. Not a warship. A shuttle sleek, angular, unmistakably Werk in its aesthetic, descending in a controlled arc toward our apron with the kind of precision that military pilots train for years to achieve. It was maybe 400 meters up, tracking steady, and from its approach vector it was going to set down right in the center of Bay 7's primary pad. There were no other security personnel in the bay. The automated lockdown had sealed the connecting corridors, and whoever should have been here before me had already been redirected elsewhere. The bay operations crew had evacuated per emergency protocol. The bay lighting was on emergency amber, which gave everything a color that I associated with bad outcomes. It was just me. I stood at the edge of the receiving apron and watched the shuttle come down. The Werk shuttle was bigger than it had looked from a distance. When it touched down, perfectly, no bounce, no correction, pure mechanical grace, it was about the size of a modest house, and the heat wash from its landing jets pushed me back 2 involuntary steps. The hull was the same dark composite material as the warships, something that ate light rather than reflecting it, so the ship looked like a hole in the air rather than an object. For maybe 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then a panel in the shuttle's flank slid open with a sound like a held breath being released, and the Werk came out. 20 of them, moving in a formation that was instantly obviously military. They spread from the ramp in a practiced pattern, establishing a perimeter around the shuttle before the last ones had cleared the hatch, and every one of them was carrying a weapon. I recognized the design from recognition training files. Werk Pulse Lances, the standard issue infantry weapon of the expansionary forces. They fired in 2 modes, suppression and termination, and neither of those modes was what you'd call gentle. Then came the ones who weren't soldiers. 3 of them following behind the soldier cordon. Their skin patterning was different, not the flat dark tones of the soldiers, but something shifting and complex, with colors I didn't have names for moving through the bioluminescence in slow waves. Diplomats or command-level officials. I had enough recognition training to know that the patterns meant something like formal authority and expectation of compliance. One of them was taller than the others, not dramatically so, maybe a few inches. But there was a quality to the way the soldiers moved around this one, creating space, angling their bodies fractionally, that said center of gravity. The way soldiers move around someone who matters. That one was looking at me. All of them were looking at me. I was the only person in the bay. Here's what I felt in the next 5 seconds. First, fear. Genuine, stomach-dropping, legs-want-to-sit-down fear. 20 armed soldiers and 3 officials from a civilization with a documented history of absorbing everyone they encountered were walking toward me across the loading apron, and I was a municipal security officer with a stun pistol and half a container of cold synthetic noodles clipped to my belt. Second, something else, something quieter and more stubborn than fear, a kind of refusal to move that wasn't exactly courage, it was more that moving felt wrong. The bay was my assigned sector. I was the security presence for Bay 7. Moving felt like abandoning something, even though what I was abandoning would have been, rationally, in the service of not getting vaporized. Third, and this is the one I've thought about the most, a very mundane, almost embarrassing thought. I should probably say something. So I did. I stepped forward, not far, maybe 3 steps. Enough to be clearly visible, clearly deliberate, clearly not hiding or retreating. My hand wasn't on my sidearm. That felt important. Not because I thought drawing would have accomplished anything useful, but because there's a language to bodies under pressure, and reaching for a weapon is a sentence in that language that ends a lot of conversations before they start. I kept my hands at my sides, open, visible. I stood straight. I looked at the tall one who was looking at me. And I said, and I'm telling you exactly what I said because I've replayed it in my head approximately 10,000 times since. This is a restricted arrival bay. I need to verify your transit authorization before I can process your docking. Silence. The kind of silence you get when approximately 20 armed soldiers and their command staff are trying to figure out whether you've lost your mind. The tall official tilted its head. The motion was very slow, very deliberate, and the bioluminescent pattern across its upper body shifted into something I later learned to recognize as something between assessment and what is this creature doing. One of the soldiers said something in Verk, a series of tonal sounds and consonant clusters that my implant's translation buffer caught partially, something approximate to "shall we proceed." The tall official raised one of its upper limbs. Stop. And then it spoke to me. The Verk language was not designed for the kind of verbal tract a human could hear cleanly, but the universal translation protocols that the station ran through its broadcast systems were good enough to catch most of it. The official's words came through my earpiece with maybe a half-second delay and the slightly mechanical quality that you always got with auto-translation. You are the station's representative. It wasn't a question. It was more like a category being established. I said, I'm the duty officer for this bay. Yes. Another pause. The pattern across the official's skin did something complex, multiple colors cycling through each other in a sequence that felt like it had a grammar to it. Later, when I read the debrief documents and the analysis that the diplomatic corps put together, I found out that this particular pattern sequence translated roughly to unexpected variable combined with recalibrating approach, which is a polite way of saying that I had confused them. The official said, "We are the advanced delegation of Fleet Prime Sarath of the 4th Verk Expansionary Arm. We are here to formalize the terms of this station's incorporation." I said, I understand. Can I see your authorization documentation? I want to pause here because I know how this sounds. People have asked me since, a lot of people in a lot of different settings, whether I was being brave or stupid or suicidal or performing some calculated act of resistance. And the honest answer is that it was none of those things exactly. It was something more automatic than that. It was just the job. I was the duty officer for Bay 7. Any vessel arriving at Bay 7 from a one-person scow to, apparently, a diplomatic shuttle from an armada of 112 warships needed to clear the same basic process. Transit authorization, registry confirmation, purpose of arrival, hazardous materials declaration if applicable. It was a checklist, and I had been trained to run the checklist, and in the 10 seconds between seeing what was coming down the ramp and opening my mouth, something in my head had simply decided that we were doing the checklist. I'm not going to claim it was heroic, but it's also not entirely fair to call it stupid. Because here's the thing about process. Process is a statement. When you stand in front of something overwhelming and say, "Let me see your paperwork," what you're saying underneath it is this is a place with rules, and the rules apply to everyone who enters, regardless of how many ships you have in orbit. It's a claim about the nature of the place. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that claim does more work than a weapon would. The official did something I still don't fully understand. It turned to the soldiers and said something short, tonal with what the translation systems parsed as a particle meaning weight. The soldiers' formation changed slightly. Not a relaxation. These weren't people who relaxed in any sense I recognized, but an adjustment, like a collective intake of breath. Then the official turned back to me and said, "Authorization documentation." The way it said it, there was a quality in the translation that was hard to describe. Like it was tasting a concept it hadn't expected to encounter. Like the word documentation was somehow interesting to it in this context. I said yes, and vessel registration, standard arrival protocol. I can pull up the forms if you need them. The official's bioluminescence did something rapid and complex across its upper torso. The two other officials behind it exchanged what I can only describe as a look, not quite human in its mechanics, but recognizable in its intent. The kind of look that says, "Are you seeing this?" Then the tall official said, "You are requesting that we submit to your arrival process." That's the procedure for any vessel docking in Bay 7, yes. We are an expansionary delegation. I understand, the procedure still applies. Another silence, longer this time. Here is what I learned afterward about what was happening in that silence. The Verk expansionary doctrine is, and this is the diplomatic language, not mine, culturally predicated on the concept of threshold recognition. The moment an expansionary delegation crosses into a space, that space is conceptually incorporated. It is no longer its own thing asking questions of the Verk. The relationship has inverted. The Verk ask the questions. Every single incorporation the Verk had conducted in the past 40 years had followed this pattern. They arrived, they were recognized as having arrived, and that recognition, the simple act of the existing population acknowledging that the Verk were present, and that this changed things, functioned as the first step in a transfer of authority that was very difficult to walk back from. What I had done, entirely by accident, was refuse to recognize that inversion. Not with a weapon, not with a political speech, not with some calculated gambit of interstellar diplomacy, with a form request. I had treated them like any other ship that needed to clear Bay 7, and in doing so I had, accidentally, through sheer reflex, made a statement that their presence didn't automatically change who was asking questions of whom. The Verk didn't have a protocol for this. In 11 incorporations, no one had ever done this. Not because no one had been brave enough, because no one had been, apparently, quite this procedurally automatic about the whole thing. The tall official took 3 steps forward. The soldiers' formation shifted, covering the movement, angles adjusting, but none of them raised their weapons. That felt significant, though I didn't know why at the time. The official stopped about 4 meters from me. Up close, the bioluminescence was something else entirely, not just color but texture, light with depth to it, patterns moving under the skin's surface like weather systems viewed from orbit. Its eyes were multifaceted, amber dark, and they were looking at me with an intensity that I can only describe as entire. It said, "You are not afraid." I thought about lying, decided against it. "I'm afraid," I said, "but this is my station's bay, and you need to complete arrival processing regardless." The pattern across the official's body did something slow and layered that took about 4 seconds. Afterward, the diplomatic analysts would describe this pattern as extraordinary interest combined with reevaluation. One of them used the phrase conceptual disruption in their report, which I thought was a fancy way of saying this person broke something in how we think about this. The official said, "What is your designation?" "Corporal Darren Mace, Kessel Station Security Detachment. And yours?" There was a sound from the soldiers then. Not quite human laughter, more like a tonal modulation that moved through several of them simultaneously, a kind of resonant murmur. Later translations described it as somewhere between astonishment and social disbelief. The kind of sound a crowd makes when someone does something that shouldn't be possible. The official's pattern shifted again, rapid, complex, layers that the translators caught partially as something like propriety and unexpected peer recognition. It said, "I am Secondary Tier Emissary Vorath, Senior Diplomatic Officer of this advanced delegation." "Emissary Vorath," I said, "welcome to Kessel Station. I'll need your vessel's registry code, your delegation manifest, and your stated purpose of arrival. The first 2 I can verify through our systems. For the third, I'll need to note it in the arrival record." Vorath looked at me for what felt like a very long time. Then it said, "Purpose of arrival, formal incorporation proceedings." "Thank you," I said. I actually pulled out my data pad and entered it. I typed the words in. I started the arrival record. "And your vessel registry code." What happened next is the part that I've been asked about most often, and the part I understand least. Vorath gave me the registry code. It reached into a compartment in its formal vestment, a layered thing, structured in a way that suggested rank without being a uniform exactly, and produced a data chip of Verk design. It extended the chip toward me. I stepped forward and took it. My hand was close enough to one of Vorath's lower limbs that I could feel the heat radiating from its skin, something higher than human baseline. I slotted the chip into my data pads reader and started verification. Behind Vorath, the two other officials were doing something I couldn't follow, a rapid exchange in Verk that the translation systems were only catching fragments of. The soldiers had not moved. Their weapons were still visible, still carried, but in postures that were not quite ready to use. My data pad beeped. Registry confirmed. Verk Diplomatic Shuttle 7 registered to the 4th Expansionary Arm, all in order as far as my systems were concerned. Registry checks out, I said. I'll need the delegation manifest, names and designations of everyone who disembarked, and then I can issue your bay access confirmation. Vorath said very quietly, "You understand what we have come here to do." "You told me, incorporation proceedings." "Yes." "That's above my clearance level," I said. "You'll need to speak with Commander Bruck. I can request a contact through station communications." I looked at my data pad, but I'll still need the manifest. I think it was the phrase above my clearance level that did it, actually. Because that phrase presupposes an entire structure. It presupposes that there are levels, and that the person speaking has a level, and that different levels handle different things, and that this is a normal and functioning hierarchy that is still in operation. It presupposes normalcy. It presupposes that the station is still running its systems, still processing its procedures, still treating the arrival of a Verk expansionary delegation as a thing that goes in an arrival record and escalates through appropriate channels. Which is the absolute opposite of what happens during an incorporation. In an incorporation, the existing structure stops being the reference point. The Verk become the reference point. The existing hierarchy doesn't have levels anymore, it becomes a record to be archived. And I had just very casually indicated that my station's hierarchy was still the reference point, that this was a thing being processed within our system rather than a thing dissolving it. Vorath was quiet for a long time. Then it turned to the two officials behind it, and the three of them had a conversation in rapid Verk that my translation systems caught maybe 30% of. What I caught included words approximate to precedent, authority claim, and something I can only render as threshold unbroken. Here is what was happening on the fleet level that I didn't know at the time. Fleet Prime Sareth was watching. The shuttle had relayed visual and audio to the flagship. Everything that had happened in Bay 7, my cold noodles, my data pad, my arrival processing checklist, had been transmitted in real time to the command deck of a 2-kilometer warship carrying weapons capable of reducing Kessel Station to its component atoms. Fleet Prime Sareth had been conducting incorporations for 22 years. It had incorporated 6 systems personally. It had seen, in those 22 years, every response that populations could produce to an expansionary arrival. Terror, capitulation, attempted resistance, negotiation, collapse, even one memorable occasion where an entire government had attempted to flee in FDL-capable ships before the Armada finished establishing its cordon. It had seen extraordinary courage, wrenching tragedy, and everything between. It had never seen arrival processing. The account I was given later, from a Verk historical document that became part of the Treaty of Kessel Station's supporting record, described Sareth's response to watching the video feed as uncharacteristic stillness. Sareth had watched Vorath produce the registry chip and hand it to me, had watched me slot it into my data pad, had watched me type incorporation proceedings into an arrival record, and had, according to the historical record, said to its command staff, "They are still running their station." The manifest. Vorath gave me the manifest. It came out on another data chip, this one formatted in the Verk binary system rather than anything my data pad could read natively, but the translation protocols handled it. 22 names, rendered in transliterated Verk phonetics, with designations next to each. Soldiers, officials, one technical specialist listed as systems assessment, which I noted in my record and flagged for Commander Bruck's attention, because that designation, in an advanced delegation for incorporation proceedings, felt important for someone with higher clearance than me to know about. I processed the manifest. I issued a Bay access confirmation, which was a procedural document that my data pad generated automatically, authorizing the delegation's presence in Bay 7 and formally logging their arrival. I handed the confirmation over to Vorath. Vorath held it. Just held it, the way you hold something when you're not quite sure what to do with it. The bioluminescent pattern across its body was doing something I didn't have a frame for, not from the recognition training, not from anything I'd encountered before. Something dense and layered, colors cycling through each other slowly, like a very long thought. I said, I'll contact Commander Bruck now. She'll need to receive your delegation in the main conference facility, which is in Sector 3. We don't typically conduct formal meetings in the bays. This is your standard procedure, Vorath said. Not a question, more like a thing being confirmed. Yes, for any official delegation arriving at the station. Any delegation. Any delegation. I made the call to Commander Bruck right there in the bay, in front of Vorath and the soldiers and the two other officials, and the shuttle sitting behind them with its hull ticking as it cooled. I raised Bruck on the secure channel, and I told her I had a Verk diplomatic delegation at Bay 7, arrival processing complete, delegation manifest filed, systems assessment specialist on board flagged per protocol, and the lead emissary was requesting formal meeting facilities. Bruck was quiet for 3 seconds. Say that again, Mace. I said it again. She was quiet for 2 more seconds. Then, you process them in. Arrival procedure. Yes, Commander. Mace. Commander. Are you telling me you ran a standard arrival on a Verk expansionary delegation? That's the procedure for arriving vessels in Bay 7. There was a pause that I think contained something Bruck wanted to say and decided not to, given that the channel was on record. Then, stand by, Corporal. Do not let them go anywhere. I'm on my way. The wait was 12 minutes. I stood in Bay 7 for 12 minutes with 20 Verk soldiers and an emissary who had just handed me documentation for an Armada visit and was now holding a bay access confirmation from a municipal station security officer, and we didn't talk much. Vorath asked me at one point how long I had served at Kessel Station, and I told it 3 years. It asked if this was typical for security personnel, and I said rotation varied, some people shorter, some longer. It asked what I did in Bay 7 on a normal rotation, and I told it. Mostly checked freight manifests and transit authorizations, occasionally ran hazardous materials verification for chemical transports. Vorath said, and you applied the same process to us. The process is the process, I said. The pattern across Vorath's body did something slow and considered. One of the 2 officials behind it said something in Verk, a short phrase, emphatically toned, and Vorath replied in kind. The translation systems caught the official's phrase as something approximately meaning it believes the form is the station. I've thought about that a lot since. It believes the form is the station. They weren't wrong exactly. Commander Yeva Bruck arrived with 6 of our officers, the most senior ones she could pull from their sectors without compromising the civilian shelter protocols. She was in full dress uniform, which I only mention because Bruck virtually never wore full dress. She understood something about what was happening that I only partially grasped. She took one look at the scene in Bay 7, the soldiers, the officials, the shuttle, me standing there with my data pad and my clipped-on container of synthetic noodles. And whatever she was thinking moved across her face in a sequence too fast to read. She walked past me to face Vorath. She said, Emissary Vorath, I'm Commander Yeva Bruck, Administrator of Kessel Station. I understand you've completed arrival processing. She didn't glance at me when she said it, but there was something in the way she held her shoulders that suggested she was choosing her words very carefully. If you're ready, I'd like to continue our discussion in the station's formal facilities. Vorath looked at Bruck, then at me, then at the bay access confirmation in its hand. It said, your corporal administered thorough arrival processing. Bruck said he did. Standard procedure. For Bay 7, yes. Vorath said something to the 2 officials behind it in Verk. The translation systems caught most of it. The station has not abandoned its form. Note this for Fleet Prime Sareth. I didn't go to the meeting in Sector 3. I wasn't senior enough, obviously. I went back to my rotation. There was a shelter-in-place situation developing in the commercial district that needed managing, and the Bay 7 situation was above my clearance level in every dimension once Commander Bruck was on the ground. I found out what happened in pieces over the next several days. The formal meeting between Commander Bruck and Emissary Vorath lasted 6 hours in standard time. Bruck was joined, via secure link, by representatives from 2 of the territorial authorities whose claims overlapped with Kessel Station's jurisdiction, the Meridian Trade Council and the Reach Colonial Authority. Neither of them had been consulted before the Werk arrived, obviously, but both of them scrambled senior representatives once the situation became clear. The Werk delegation's stated purpose in corporation proceedings was on the table from the start. Vorath presented the standard terms: join the collective, surrender autonomous governance, retain lives and most infrastructure. And Bruck said, we'd like to review those terms through our standard procedural process. The same phrase, not an accident. She said it was deliberate. She told me later, after everything was settled in her office over terrible station coffee, that she'd watched the Bay 7 feed from her own terminal before she'd walked in, and she'd understood immediately what I'd done, even if I hadn't fully understood it myself. You framed us, she said, not accusing. You framed us as a place that was still running, still processing. You made us procedurally present. The Werk, it turned out, had extensive philosophical framework around the concept of incorporation. The threshold recognition principle wasn't just tactical. It was deeply embedded in their cultural and political understanding of how authority worked. When a space acknowledged the arrival of the expansionary forces as the event that changed everything, it was conceptually yielding threshold. The space was saying, you being here is the new reality. But if the space kept running its processes, kept filing manifests and issuing Bay confirmations and escalating things through appropriate channels, it was not yielding the threshold. It was saying, you being here is a thing we are processing like everything else we process. And the Werk genuinely had never encountered this before. The discussions went on for 3 weeks. I won't pretend I was part of them. I was not. I went back to Bay 7 rotations, to hazmat checks, to breaking up market district arguments about spice pricing. The things above my clearance level remained above my clearance level. But I followed what I could through the station's broadcast system, and some of it filtered through from people who were in the room. Bruck told me some things. A diplomat from the Meridian Trade Council, a woman named Seti Akaffer who had sharp eyes and a habit of eating in the station commissary where regular people ate, told me some things. A Werk technical specialist, the one I'd flagged on the manifest, came through Bay 7 on a legitimate survey visit in the 2nd week, and told me a few things in the stilted but genuine way of someone who was trying to bridge a gap and wasn't sure of the distance. What emerged was this. Fleet Prime Sareth had, after watching the Bay 7 feed in real time, ordered the Armada to a holding pattern rather than a deployment position. In Werk expansionary doctrine, there is a difference. Holding pattern is what you do when something isn't resolved yet. Deployment is what you do when you're about to make things resolved. The Armada had gone to holding. Sareth had then requested, through Vorath, through diplomatic channels, something that the Werk had apparently never formally requested during an incorporation proceeding: more time. Specifically, more time to assess what they were incorporating. Because the station was, according to Vorath's report back to the flagship, running normally. The Werk had models for what a space looked like when it was about to be incorporated. The models were based on 11 previous incorporations. In every single one there had been a period, sometimes hours, sometimes days, of what they termed form collapse. The existing structures stopped functioning normally, the processes broke down, the population was clearly in a state of waiting for the new authority to define what came next. The threshold was yielded, and the space reorganized itself around the new center. Kessel Station was not experiencing form collapse. The markets were running carefully with reduced hours and heightened security, but running. The administrative systems were processing. The medical bays were operating. The security detachment was doing its rounds. And some corporal in Bay 7 was still filing arrival manifests. Sareth told Vorath, according to the historical record, we cannot incorporate a station that does not acknowledge it as being incorporated. This was, apparently, a genuine philosophical problem. Not a legal one. The Werk had the firepower to resolve it in a much less philosophical way. But Sareth was, by all accounts, not a creature who resolved things that didn't need resolving by that method. The expansionary doctrine called for voluntary threshold yielding as the standard pathway. The hard option was reserved for when the standard pathway was rejected. The standard pathway hadn't been rejected. It hadn't been acknowledged. HFY was the one who told me about the pivotal moment in the third week of discussions. She described it as coming after a long session, hours of procedural review, terms analysis, jurisdictional discussions. When Vorath said something that wasn't in the formal agenda. Said it to Bruck directly, not as a diplomatic formulation, but as a kind of genuine inquiry. It asked, "When your security officer applied your arrival process to us, was that a deliberate statement, a form of resistance?" Bruck told it the truth. She said he applied the procedure. That's what he does. That's what this station does. Vorath was quiet for a moment, then it said, "He was not resistant, he was simply present." "Yes," Bruck said. "The station was simply present." "Yes." Vorath said, "This is unusual." Bruck said, "Is it?" And Vorath said something that HFY translated for me later, a phrase that the diplomatic record rendered as approximately. "In 11 incorporations, we have never found a place that did not first, even briefly, stop being itself." The Treaty of Kessel Station was signed on the 22nd day. It was not an incorporation. That's the headline version, the one that went out on the news feeds and made it into the diplomatic histories. Kessel Station was not incorporated into the Werk Collective. It became, instead, what the treaty termed a threshold neutral zone, a recognized independent transit hub under a joint governance framework that included Werk oversight representation, but preserved the station's existing administrative structure and autonomous decision-making on internal matters. It was the first time in 22 years of expansionary activity that the Werk had offered this form of agreement. Their diplomatic staff said, for the record, that it reflected a recognition that Kessel Station's unique position at the junction of multiple trade corridors made it more valuable as a functioning neutral space than as an incorporated territory. The trade logic was real. I don't want to underplay it. But I was in the room when Bruck told me the unofficial version, and she looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then she said, "Sareth told Vorath at the end that there was no precedent in their doctrine for incorporating a space that had never stopped processing you as an arrival. There's a version of this story where I'm the hero. It's not the version I'm telling you. The version I'm telling you is the one where I was tired and hungry and had cold noodles in a container on my belt and was doing my job the only way I knew how to do it. And something happened because of that which I didn't fully understand until long after it was over. The heroic version is cleaner. It has intention in it, a decision, a stand, a choice to do something brave in the face of overwhelming force. I've read the news pieces that described it that way, and they're not entirely wrong in their facts, but they're wrong about what was happening inside the person they're writing about. What was happening inside me in Bay 7 when I asked Emissary Vorath for their manifest was not heroism. It was habit. It was the specific kind of muscle memory that comes from doing a thing so many times that it becomes prior to thought. I processed arrivals. That was the job. Something arrived and I processed it. And the reason that mattered, the reason it did the thing it did, the reason Sareth ordered a holding pattern, the reason Vorath carried a bay access confirmation issued by a municipal station security officer back to a 2-kilometer flagship, the reason there was a treaty instead of an incorporation, wasn't because of anything particular about me. It was because of what my doing the job automatically, without panic, without collapse, said about the station. The station was still there. The station was still running its procedures. The station had looked at something overwhelming, and its first instinct had been to ask for the paperwork. That apparently mysteriously, in a way I don't think any of us planned or designed, was the thing the Werk didn't have a protocol for. Not defiance, not resistance, not heroic refusal, just normalcy, just the stubborn, mundane insistence of a functional place on processing what comes through it the way it processes everything. Vorath came back to Bay 7 on the last day. The delegation was preparing to depart. The treaty was signed. The formal handshakes, or whatever the Werk equivalent was, had been completed. The Armada was moving to a new formation that corresponded to peaceful transit rather than active deployment. Vorath came to the bay without soldiers. Just the 2 officials from the initial delegation, walking with it through the corridors in a way that seemed more like accompaniment than escort. I was on rotation. Of course I was on rotation. Vorath stopped when it saw me. The bioluminescent pattern did something quick and bright across its upper body. It said, "Corporal Mace." "Emissary Vorath," I said. "Is there anything you need before departure? I can process your exit documentation." The two officials exchanged a look. "That same, are you seeing this quality as before?" Vorath said, "Yes, please process our exit documentation." So I did. I pulled up the data pad, ran the departure protocol, noted the delegation's date of arrival and date of departure, logged the transit as formally concluded per the treaty terms, and issued an exit confirmation. I handed it to Vorath. Vorath held it, again with that quality of holding something that wasn't quite expected. Then it said something that I've been turning over in my mind ever since, in the way you turn over things that feel important but that you're not sure you fully understand. "You kept the form. When we arrived with a fleet of 112 ships and the intent to absorb this station, you kept the form. Do you understand what that means to us?" I said honestly, "Not entirely." "It means you told us without words that this place had something we were not accounting for. We could not incorporate what we could not first reach, and we could not reach you because you were still here." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said what came naturally. "You're clear for departure, emissary. Safe transit." Vorath's pattern did one more complex movement, something layered and slow. Then it inclined its body in what the recognition files described as a formal acknowledgement between recognized parties, the Verk equivalent of a bow. It walked past me toward the shuttle. At the top of the ramp, it stopped and turned. "Corporal Mace, if you are ever traveling in Verk space, which is extensive, present this." It reached into its vestment and produced a small object, a Verk data seal, flat, ovoid, the size of my palm. The kind that encoded authority and identity. It held it out. I took it. Then Vorath went up the ramp and the panel slid shut, and the shuttle lifted off Bay 7's primary pad with that same mechanical grace, and rose through the amber-lit sky toward the armada above. I stood in Bay 7 for a while after that. The amber emergency lighting had been switched back to normal operations. White gold, steady, the everyday light of a working station. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the market district beginning to come back to life, voices and movement, and the particular hum of an inhabited place resuming its normal patterns. The thermal groaning of the hull, dust devils on the apron. My data pad beeped. A new arrival was incoming. A Meridian trade freighter 2 hours out, routine cargo declaration, nothing complicated. I started the arrival process. Because that's the job. That's always the job, keep the form. Process what comes. Hold the line with the only thing you actually have, which is the insistence that this place is still here, still running, still itself, regardless of what comes in from the sky. The galaxy, apparently, hadn't expected that. I'm still not entirely sure why. But I've got a data seal from an emissary of the 4th Verk expansionary arm in my pocket, and a treaty named after our station on the diplomatic record. And somewhere in a Verk historical archive, there is a record that describes how 60,000 people on a frontier station kept their heads and their processes when 112 warships came out of FTL overhead. And the record begins with a Bay access confirmation, filed properly, in triplicate. Because that's how we do it in Bay 7. Some people said one human couldn't stop an army. They were right. He didn't stop it. He processed it, and the army didn't know what to do next. You have to understand something about Fleet Prime Sareth before I tell you what came next. The thing about the people who command expansionary fleets, and this is something I only learned much later, from documents released as part of the treaty record, and from a very long conversation with a Verk historical scholar who visited the station 2 years after all of this happened, is that they are not chosen for brutality. The common assumption, the one humans make when we think invading force, is that the people at the top of it are the hardest, most aggressive, most conquest-minded. And maybe that's true for some of them, but the Verk expansionary program selects for something different at the command level. It selects for certainty. Not confidence exactly, not even competence, though they have plenty of that. It's something more specific, the ability to operate without ambiguity, the capacity to be entirely sure of what is happening and what to do about it, because a fleet of 112 ships and thousands of personnel cannot afford a commander who hesitates, who doesn't know. Fleet Prime Sareth had been certain for 22 years. And then it had watched a video feed of a human in a gray uniform asking an expansionary emissary for transit documentation, and something had happened to its certainty that it apparently didn't have words for. This too I found out later, but it matters now as background. I was on a rest rotation the day the message arrived. This was maybe 3 weeks after the treaty signing. Life on the station had largely normalized. The holding pattern of Verk ships was gone from the sky, replaced by normal transit traffic, the usual freighters and traders and survey vessels. The treaty had generated an enormous amount of administrative work that other people were dealing with, joint governance framework documents, and oversight schedule negotiations, and the specific jurisdictional questions that arose from having Verk representatives embedded in a station that still ran on its own procedures. None of that was my clearance level. I was back to Bay 7 rotations, hazmat checks, market district disputes. The message came through official channels, routed from the Verk diplomatic liaison that the treaty had established on the station. It was addressed to me specifically, by name and designation, from a source that the routing system identified as flagship of the 4th Expansionary Arm. From Fleet Prime Sareth, it said in translation, Corporal Darren Mace, Kessel Station Security Detachment. I have reviewed the documentation of your arrival procedure conducted on day 1 of the Kessel Station engagement. I wish to request a meeting. The purpose of the meeting is personal inquiry, not formal diplomatic business. The request is not an order. I recognize that such framing would be inappropriate given the treaty terms. I will be present at Kessel Station in 14 days if you are willing. I read it 3 times. Then I went to Commander Bruck, because obviously I went to Commander Bruck. Bruck read it standing up, which she did with things she was concentrating on. She read it twice, put the data pad down, and looked at the middle distance for a moment. Personal inquiry, she said. That's what it says. From the Fleet Prime. Yes, Commander. Mace, do you understand how remarkable that is? I said I understood it was unusual. Bruck gave me the look she reserved for people who were being technically accurate in a way that was still understating the situation. A Verk Fleet Prime has never, in the documented history of their expansionary program, made a personal request to speak with anyone below senior diplomatic rank from an incorporation target. This, she tapped the data pad, does not have precedent. I seem to be generating a lot of those. She almost smiled. What are you going to say? I told her I was going to say yes. Sareth arrived on a small shuttle without military escort. Just diplomatic staff, Vorath, and 2 others I recognized from the treaty sessions. The shuttle was smaller than the first one, almost civilian in its profile, and it landed because of course it did in Bay 7. I was the duty officer. I processed the arrival. I logged the delegation, ran the manifest, noted Fleet Prime Sareth's designation in the arrival record, and issued the Bay access confirmation. All of it by hand on the data pad, the same way I'd done it the first time. Sareth came down the ramp and stopped when it saw me doing the paperwork, and its bioluminescent pattern did something that I recognized. By now, I'd done enough reading on Verk body language to identify basic states as something between amusement and something harder to name. Something like wonder, if wonder can look quiet and a little tired. It said, "You are processing our arrival again." "Standard procedure," I said. "Of course." We met in a small conference room in Sector 2, not the main diplomatic facility, because this was, as the message had said, personal inquiry. Commander Bruck had made it available and then stepped entirely out of it, which I appreciated more than I said at the time. It was me, Sareth, and Vorath who functioned as interpreter when the auto-translation systems were insufficient for nuance. Sareth sat across a table from me, or rather, it adopted the Verk posture that the closest human analogy to sitting corresponds to. It was larger than Vorath, with more complex patterning, older-looking in a way I couldn't have defined but felt clearly. Sareth said, "I want to understand what you were thinking when you asked Emissary Vorath for documentation." I told it what I told you, that I wasn't thinking in any planned way, that it was the procedure, that I processed arrivals and something arrived. Sareth listened to this, and was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "You were not making a statement." Not consciously, but the statement was made. Apparently, Sareth's pattern did something slow and complex. It said, "In 22 years of incorporation operations, I have encountered everything. Fear, courage, negotiation, collapse, violence, surrender, extraordinary acts and ordinary ones. I have seen people do remarkable things when confronted with our arrival. What I have never seen is the absence of disruption." I said the station kept running. "The station kept running," Sareth confirmed. "Do you know what that communicates in our understanding? When a space continues to function through our arrival, continues to process to maintain its form, it communicates something we call Vareth asterisk. There is no precise translation. It is the quality of a thing that cannot be removed from itself, a stability that is not rigidity but persistence. The difference between a wall, which you can break, and water, which you can displace but cannot destroy." "You cannot incorporate water," Voreth said quietly from the side, not translating now, commenting. "No," Sareth agreed. "You cannot incorporate water." We talked for 2 hours. Sareth asked me a lot of questions about Kessel Station. Not strategic questions, not governance questions, but texture questions. What the market district sounded like in the morning. What the emergency amber lighting felt like to be under. What synthetic noodles tasted like. Whether Bay 7 had always been my rotation, or if I'd come to it from somewhere else. I answered all of it. It was an unusual conversation, the most unusual of my life probably, but it had a quality to it that was, I keep coming back to this word, genuine. Like someone who had encountered something they didn't understand and had decided, rather than categorizing it and moving on, to try to actually understand it. At one point Sareth said, "We have a concept in our doctrine about places that resist incorporation. It is not a positive concept. It describes a posture, a deliberate, armed refusal of the threshold. We have encountered it 4 times. Twice it ended in destruction. Twice it ended in negotiated settlement under extremely difficult conditions. We do not enjoy the concept. It is costly in many ways." I said I could understand that. "What you did is not that concept. What your station did, has no concept in our doctrine. There is no framework for a space that simply continued. That did not resist, but also did not yield. That processed us as though we were a thing to be processed." "What happens now?" I asked. "Is there a concept for after this?" Sareth's pattern did something very slow, very layered. It said, "We are building one. This is unusual for us. Our doctrine is very old. It does not often require new concepts." "Kessel Station required a new concept," Voreth said, and there was something in the way the translation rendered it that felt like pride, though I wasn't sure whose. Before Sareth left, it said one more thing to me that I've carried since. It said, "I reviewed the video of your arrival procedure, including one detail that I did not initially notice. The food container, attached to your equipment." I said, slightly embarrassed, "Cold noodles, I hadn't finished lunch." "You were eating when we arrived." "I was on a slow rotation. Nothing big was due in." Sareth's pattern did the thing I'd started identifying as amusement. This detail was in Voreth's report to me. Voreth described it as the most significant thing it observed. I looked at Voreth. The noodles were significant. Voreth said, "It told us before you said a single word that you were not anticipating us. You were not prepared for us. You were not afraid of us, or rather, you were afraid, but the fear was not the first thing. The first thing was lunch. A person who is about to face something that has ended every other place it has visited does not typically stop for lunch. A person who is simply doing the rotation does. The food told us your station was still running in a way no statement could have." Sareth said, 11 incorporations, and the thing that changed our approach was a container of cold noodles. I don't know how to end this story because it hasn't really ended. The Treaty of Kessel Station is 3 years old now. The joint governance framework is messy and complicated and occasionally deeply frustrating for everyone involved. But it's working in the way that things work when everyone has agreed that working is what they're going to do. We have a permanent Werk diplomatic office in Sector 4, which has required some interesting architectural adjustments because the environmental preferences are different. The market district, which is the heart of the station in every sense, has expanded by about 12% since the treaty opened up Verk trade routes to the station's corridor junctions. 60,000 people became closer to 74,000, and then 80,000, and the prefab modules that used to flex uncomfortably are being replaced with proper construction in phases. Commander Bruck is still the administrator. She got a commendation from 3 different governments that I'm not sure she's ever formally acknowledged. I'm still in the security detachment. Bay 7 mostly, some rotation. New arrivals processed in the usual way. There's a plaque now on the wall of Bay 7. Someone put it up 6 months after the treaty. I don't know who. It appeared one morning and Bruck said she didn't order it, so it was either a spontaneous thing from the station community or someone in the diplomatic corps with a sense of occasion. It's a simple thing. Station alloy engraved, it says. On this apron, the arrival processing of a Verk expansionary delegation on date contributed to the establishment of the Treaty of Kessel Station. Duty performed by Corporal Darren Mace, Bay 7 duty officer. And below that, someone added by hand, scratched in, not engraved, so it was definitely an unofficial addition, a single line. He asked for the paperwork. I've had a lot of time to think about what the right lesson is. Whether there is a lesson. Whether what happened here generalizes to anything, or whether it was a perfect storm of specific factors. The Verk's philosophical framework around threshold recognition, the specific personality of Sareth, the fact that Kessel Station's multi-jurisdictional weirdness made it harder to incorporate cleanly on any terms, 100 other things that aren't a guard with cold noodles. Probably there's no clean lesson. Reality is rarely that tidy. But I think about what Vorath said, you kept the form, and what Sareth said, Vareth, the quality of a thing that cannot be removed from itself. And I think there is something in there about what it means to be present. Not brave, necessarily. Not strategic. Just present. Just operational. Just insisting, through the act of continuing to function, that this is a place with a nature of its own. That this nature doesn't evaporate because something larger arrived. That the form of the thing is worth maintaining not as a statement of power, but as a statement of existence. I am here, I am still here. I was here before you came, and I am still here now, and I'm going to need your documentation before we proceed. Not every force in the galaxy knows what to do with that. Some forces, apparently, don't have a protocol for it. And sometimes, not always, not predictably, not as a rule you can extract and apply, the absence of a protocol is the space where something other than what was planned can happen. The noodles are still cold, most rotations. The data pad still beeps when a new arrival is incoming. Bay 7 is still Bay 7. And the sky, when I look up from the apron on the slow shifts, is full of the ordinary traffic of a station that is still running. That's the whole story. That's all of it. The galaxy threw 112 ships at one station. And the station threw back a form request and a manifest verification. Somehow, impossibly, stubbornly, in the way that only ordinary things can be, the station won. The story got out. I didn't tell it, or I told it once, to a journalist from a Meridian Trade Council publication named Harson Call, who I thought was doing a piece on the economic effects of the treaty. He was also, it turned out, doing a piece on the human side of the story, and the thing he wrote included the noodles, which I wish he'd left out but can't be too angry about because it was accurate. That piece got picked up by a relay feed, then another. Then somewhere in the chain, a Verk media outlet, they have them. It surprised me too, translated and published their own version, which circulated through whatever the Verk equivalent of networks are. And the thing took on a life of its own in the way that stories sometimes do when they contain something people feel they've been waiting to be told. The short version that circulated was, one human with a data pad and a cold lunch held the threshold on a frontier station against an expansionary armada, and it worked. The version I just told you is more complicated than that. It involves philosophy and doctrine and the specific architectural weirdness of the Verk's threshold recognition framework, and a lot of things that were happening that I didn't know about at the time. But the short version wasn't wrong exactly. It was just missing the texture. What I didn't expect, what no one expected, was what it did when it circulated. The first station that contacted Kessel's administrative office was a place called Dunmore Hub, about 40 light-years out in the Dust Arm. They sent a formal inquiry, routed through the diplomatic channels because the treaty framework was now the appropriate address for certain kinds of Kessel Station correspondence. The inquiry was from Dunmore Hub's station commander, a woman I'd never met, a Velari named Prex Otten, and it said, stripped of the formal language, "We may be in a similar situation. Can you tell us how you did it?" Bruck handled the response at her level, but she told me about it. She said, "They've had a survey fleet in their approach corridor for 2 weeks. Not very different situation, but the dynamic has similarities." I said, "I just did the job." Bruck said, "I know. Tell me how to explain that to someone who needs to hear it." I tried. I wrote a document, not an official procedure, just a reflection, a few pages, about what had happened and what I thought it came down to. I sent it to Bruck. She passed it on to Prex Otten at Dunmore Hub. I don't know exactly what happened at Dunmore Hub. The situation was different enough that whatever they did couldn't be a direct copy of what I'd done. But 6 weeks later, Prex Otten sent a message to Bruck, and Bruck forwarded it to me. It said the station is still here. It worked. There were 4 more in the following year. Each one was different species, different circumstances, different kinds of pressure. One was an economic situation, not a military one. A corporate entity making what amounted to a takeover bid for a station's infrastructure under treaty terms that were technically legal but practically coercive. The station's administrative team ran every process with complete transparency and proper procedure, which made the coercion visible in a way that opaque collapse would not have. And the corporate entity eventually withdrew because the situation was too clean to exploit. One was a population displacement crisis, refugees from a failing colony system arriving in numbers that threatened to overwhelm a small station's capacity. The station kept running, kept processing, kept doing triage and registration and the 100 small procedures of a functioning place, even when the numbers were impossible. It didn't fix the underlying crisis, but it held the form until larger resources could arrive, and the station was still recognizably itself when they did. One was, as far as I can tell, almost identical to what happened at Kessel. Different fleet, different demand, same instinct by a duty officer to run the arrival protocol and ask for documentation. That one ended without a treaty. It ended with the fleet leaving, because a station that wouldn't stop processing it was, apparently, more complicated than it was worth. I'm not building a legend here. I want to be clear about that. Most of these situations aren't going to resolve the way Kessel Station resolved. Most situations that involve overwhelming force and coercion don't end because someone filed a manifest. The universe isn't a place where procedural correctness defeats armadas as a rule. I know that. I'm not telling you this is a technique. I'm not saying do the paperwork and everything will work out. What I'm saying is something smaller and maybe more honest. I'm saying form is not nothing. The insistence on continuing to function, on maintaining process, on running the protocols, on treating even impossible arrivals as things to be handled in the ordinary way is not nothing. It's a claim. A small one maybe, probably insufficient on its own in most circumstances, but not nothing. It says we are still here. We are still the thing we were. You being here does not automatically change that. And sometimes, not always, not reliably, but sometimes, that claim lands somewhere. In the framework of something you're dealing with. In the philosophy of a fleet prime watching a video feed. In the decision of a corporate entity that finds a clean process harder to exploit than a chaotic one. In the courage of a population that keeps doing the ordinary things and in the doing of them keeps being themselves. Harson Call, the journalist, came back about a year later to do a follow-up piece. He came through Bay 7, obviously. I was on rotation. He stood on the apron watching me process a routine cargo manifest from a Meridian freighter, and when I was done, he said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you just stepped back, let them walk past?" I thought about it. Probably fine, I said. Probably Bruck would have handled it from the diplomatic end, and there would have been a treaty anyway, or there would have been an incorporation. Either way, 60,000 people would still be alive. So it might not have mattered. It might not have. He thought about that. But it did. It did. He said, "Why do you think it did?" And I said, this is the truest thing I've found to say about it. Because when you're standing in front of something that could end everything and your first instinct is to do your job, that tells the thing in front of you something true about where you're standing. It tells them this is a place. Not an obstacle, not a temporary inconvenience on the way to something else. A place with a nature doing its thing. And some things, not all things, but some things don't have a move for that. The data seal from Vorath is on my workbench at home. I've never used it. Never traveled in Verk space, can't imagine I will. But it sits there on the workbench next to the data pad charger, and a coffee mug I never quite get around to washing, and sometimes I look at it. It's a small thing, flat, ovoid, fits in my palm. It catches the light in a way that suggests depth, like the bioluminescence it's imitating hasn't quite decided to stop. It means something, formal acknowledgement from an expansionary emissary, a kind of recognition that the recognition files would describe as peer-level respect between recognized parties. For a corporal in a municipal security detachment. I think about Vorath saying you kept the form. I think about Sareth saying Vareth, the quality of a thing that cannot be removed from itself. I think about 60,000 people going about their lives in the market district and the residential sectors, while 112 ships sat in the sky, and how most of them didn't know that the thing keeping them in some sense intact was the ordinary stubborn fact of all of them still being here, still running their lives, still arguing about spice prices and filing transit paperwork and eating cold noodles in the middle of slow rotations. Water, Sareth said we were like water. You can displace it, but you can't destroy it. Bay 7 is quiet this rotation. Nothing big due in. The sky through the observation port is ordinary transit traffic, the familiar lights of freighters on approach. The twin suns are settling toward the horizon again, doing the thing where they turn the dust on the loading apron from gray to something almost gold. My data pad is on standby. Somewhere in the distance, the market district is doing what it does. Noise and movement and the smell of things cooking and the language of commerce in 8 different tongues happening simultaneously. The sound of a place being alive. 60,000 people, 80,000 now. The expansion was completed last season, living in a station that is still here, still running, still itself. My data pad beeps. Incoming arrival, 2 hours out routine. I start the protocol. Name of vessel, registry code, stated purpose of transit. Same as always. Same as it will be tomorrow. The form kept. The station present. 1 human still on rotation. The galaxy never expected a data pad and a half-eaten lunch to be the thing that held the line. But the galaxy, it turns out, doesn't always know what it's walking into. Sometimes the most immovable thing in the universe is a person just doing the job. That's it. That's the whole thing. End of Part 3. Epilogue, what they wrote in the VAREK historical record. I'm including this because Akafer, Seti Akafer, the diplomat from the Meridian Trade Council, brought me a translated copy 2 years after the treaty, and I think it belongs here. This is what the 4th Expansionary Arms historical record says about the Kessel Station engagement. It's been cleared for publication under the treaty's information-sharing provisions. I've read it many times. Each time I read it, I feel something that I can't quite name, not pride exactly, or at least not the simple kind. Something more complicated and quieter. The record says, on the date of engagement, the advanced delegation under Emissary Vorath made surface contact with Kessel Station. Upon arrival in the designated bay, the delegation encountered a single station security officer who initiated the standard arrival processing protocol, a procedure designed for the registration of civilian and commercial vessels. The officer did not interrupt this procedure for the arrival of an expansionary delegation. Emissary Vorath underwent the arrival process. Fleet Prime Sareth, observing via relay, noted that the station's operational continuity, its maintenance of standard procedure in the face of the delegation's arrival, presented a circumstance with no established doctrine precedent. Fleet Prime Sareth ordered the Armada to holding pattern. Over the following 22 days, discussions were conducted that resulted in the Treaty of Kessel Station, the first non-incorporation agreement in the history of the 4th Expansionary Arms active operations. The historical analysis of this engagement has identified the following contributing factors: the unique jurisdictional complexity of the station, the trade value of its corridor position, the philosophical implications of uninterrupted threshold maintenance, and the tactical ambiguity of an engagement target that did not exhibit anticipated form collapse. However, the record notes that the initiating factor, the element that established the framework within which all subsequent discussions occurred, was a procedural act by a single human security officer of municipal rank. His arrival processing documentation is preserved in the historical archive. It remains the only instance of a Verk expansionary delegation receiving a Bay access confirmation prior to formal incorporation proceedings. The officer's name was Corporal Darren Mace. He was performing his rotation, and somewhere in a frontier station at the junction of 3 trade corridors, the job is still being done. Day after day, rotation after rotation. Form kept. Station present. Humans still here.